All right, this is my first PC build. Just doing a little video documentary here on my trials and tribulations. And we're following some step-by-step stuff from YouTube channels, just to go over some basic specs here. Got a 4 gigabyte hard drive using the NZXT H510i medium tower. I have the Thermal Lake power supply, 2 extra fans, 1 terabyte Evo Plus Samsung SSD, and I have 32 gigabytes of RAM, a fairly mid-low range GPU. It's not necessarily a gaming rig. A lot of this stuff I'll be using is for virtual machines, programming, things like that. Got a Ryzen 7 and a Gigabyte B450 Aorus Pro Wi-Fi motherboard. So I'll be walking through this step by step, really again just to document my own trials and tribulations, to go back and look how the build went, and I will provide links for all the products below. Just wanted to start off documenting some tools I'll be using through this PC build. Just some real basic things here. I do have these power supply extenders for the power supply, just make things look a little neater. I do have a red and black case, so I got the red power supplies just for, color scheme, consistency. Some basic tools. I got this toolkit off Amazon, pretty inexpensive. I'll be using all these tools, or even a quarter of them. Main tool will be likely this magnetic tipped screwdriver, also from Amazon, really fairly cheap. Be downloading Windows 10 Pro ISO file, so I'll need the USB, notebook and pen, just to document findings, errors, things I came across. And I got these Velcro straps. Not sure if I'll need these. But again, just to tidy up the cabling in the tower, just in case. Also Amazon. So a lot of this was just Amazon purchases. Again, fairly inexpensive. 2 other tools I'll be using is zip ties. Not sure if I'll use these over the Velcro ties, but having them out just in case. And just a pair of snipping tools. Scissors are fine. I happen to have these laying around, so I'll be using those. Okay, first thing we're going to do here is we're going to install the CPU onto the motherboard. As mentioned before, I did get an AMD Ryzen 7 CPU, so I have a motherboard compatible with the AM4 CPU socket. CPU also came with a heatsink with pre-applied thermal covering. There's thermal paste available should you need to apply it to the CPU, but the instructions for Ryzen do specify that it's pre-applied and the thermal paste is not necessary. So I'm going to open up this. I'll put aside all the cables for the motherboard, SATA cables, some extra Wi-Fi antenna, and some extra parts here just in case I need them. And then the cables for the heatsink are aside as well. So I'll go ahead and open this up and start with that. Okay, just a few things before I install the CPU here. So you see the gold contact pins, and if you notice there's a little gold triangle in the one corner of the CPU. That's going to match up with the triangle on the AMD 4 socket right there in that corner. There's a little lever that will lift up before we install it. And then these are the heatsink attachments to keep it secure to the motherboard. One thing I did do, there was some just kind of wrapping, saran wrap here on some of the parts that I removed, just to make sure that gets removed first once this is powered on and starts to heat up. Don't want melted plastic to the motherboard. So we'll go ahead and we will start with the CPU installation. The I/O shield is already installed on the motherboard. It's screwed in. I may need to take that off once I get to the phase of installing the motherboard, most likely I'll have to uninstall the IO shield and then reinstall it, but we'll see. I might not need to do that. Okay, so I am being very careful not to touch any of the pin contacts. This is a very important step. Just want to make sure that we don't bend any of the pins on the CPU, because that will pretty much ruin it, which would be bad. So I should be able to just lay this on the AM4 socket, just gently matching up the arrows. I'm just kind of feeling it go into place. So just with a little slight wiggle, I thought it'd sink right in, and then just even pressure. The lever does down, and that's it. Okay, I'm going to install the heatsink on top of the CPU now. As mentioned before, if your heatsink does not come with pre-applied thermal paste, you could buy it. It's relatively inexpensive. You could just apply it directly on top of the CPU when applying the cooling fan. Usually like a pea-sized drop right in the middle of the CPU, and just leave it there. And then once you press down the heatsink, it spreads it out over the CPU, and this just to dissipate the heat off the CPU and obviously make it run smoother and cooler. But in this case, don't need to do that. It comes with these pre-installed brackets on either side of the CPU to keep the heatsink in place. In some other market heatsinks, you may have to remove these. It may not require them. In this build, because the heatsink came with the CPU, I will be using these brackets. One thing I did do, just part of the instructions, always look at the instructions. This is the CPU instructions here. It tells you pretty much step by step what to do if you're using the stock heatsink, which I'll be following. But the first thing I did was just take my Phillips screwdriver and check these screws and just gently tighten them if they need to be tightened. They were already tightened, but you just want to double check because it needs to be pretty secure. But now that we're going to be installing it, there is these retention brackets on this side. Now only the one side has the lever to keep it secure. In the installation guide, the lever was on the right bracket, so that's how I'll be doing it. So I'll just be installing it straight down, attaching it to these little notches here, and then pushing the lever down to keep it secure. Okay, that went pretty smoothly. The one thing I was a little apprehensive about is when I flipped the lever, it was down here. I felt a lot of pressure around this point before it got here, and I was a little worried. I didn't want to destroy or crack the CPU, but I got over my fears. I continued, and it's now very secure, very snug. So the next step is just plugging in the fan header. You'll see there's two plugs here for the CPU. So the CPU fan and the CPU OPT. So this is just a normal fan. So I'll be plugging it into this top on the fan. The OPT is for if I had a liquid cooling system. So really, it's a 4-pin connector. So it's a pretty straightforward, just plug it in here and secured snug, and that's that. One thing I forgot to install in the CPU fan there's some optional plugins that we can use. There's two of them. One is for a USB port, which I'm not going to use just because I don't want to take up one of my USBs. This really is just used if you want to update software on the fan, because it is an RGB fan. The other one I do want to use is the RBG cable. So I'll plug this in, and it will go, looked into the motherboard user guide, and it instructs us to use the LED CPU plug-in here. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to install the SSD next. I have the 970 EVO Plus NVMe M2 by Samsung. Again, I also have a 4 terabyte hard drive I'm going to be installing later, but I really just wanted to make this build as fast as possible given the budget I had. So I wanted to use the NVMe M2 format as opposed to the 2.5 SSD. It looks more like a traditional hard drive, just for a little quicker functionality. You can see it's very thin, very fragile, but there's 2 M2 slots here on the motherboard. I have the shorter of the 2, so just unscrew it. There's a protective film you want to just remove from this for installing. Fairly easy install. You'll see there's a little notch at the top. It'll match the notch in the slot there, and then there's a little semicircle here. This is going to match up with the screw placement, and the screw will actually hold it down. So just want to gently match those notches up. Give it a little push, not too hard. And see it's in there. It's a little springy. That's okay once you screw it down. It's supposed to be that way by design. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. Installing the memory cards next. So I have DDR4 memory cards from Corsair, the Vengeance RGB Pro. So they're 16 gigabytes each, so we have a total of 32 gigs. Here we'll see on the motherboard we have 4 channels for the memory. So there's channel A and B, and it goes every other. So you know, this will be one channel, slots 1 and 3, and then slots 2 and 4 will be another channel. So for that reason, we want to make sure we install the memory on every other channel. It's suggested that you always use the same company and memory sticks, basically the exact same memory cards, if you're going to fill these up all 4. For right now, 32 gigabytes of RAM is plenty of memory for what I'm looking to do. More than enough probably, but I just wanted to, again, go for speed here, so I got the little extra. You know, the OS I'll be using really can only handle 64 anyway, so if I did 2 more, it's maxing it out in terms of what the memory can handle. So I'll be installing these every other. It's pretty easy installation. There's a little latch here. Just want to gently take those latches down, and you'll see there's a little notch in the memory card here. It's off center for a reason. It'll match up to a notch there. So essentially it's foolproof. You know, you want to match the notches up, and because they're off center, it can only go in one way, which is how it's designed and what you want to do. So I'll install those now. I had a little backwards in the previous video. So I mentioned I thought this was 1 and going all the way to 4 here, but pays to look at the motherboard and follow directions. So you'll see it's actually the opposite. So the one closest, furthest away from the fan is the first slot. So this would be channels 1 and 3. So channel A. So that's what I want to put it in. So I already installed the 1, and going to install the other now. Again, pretty foolproof. It's going to match up the notches here. So I just want to drop that in very gently. Some slight pressure just to push down, make sure it's installed. Oh. See? Foolproof. Wrong notch. Wrong side. Okay. So again, just ever so gently. And then we will put these latches up. It's fighting me a little bit. So if you push down, it actually clips in. Helps to put it in the right slot, right? So this is why we're doing the videos, trial and error. And a lot of this is just being mindful of what you're doing. following directions. It's not too difficult, I think, to build your own PC. So it's my first time, so I expect trial and error, and probably most of the errors will be user errors. So hope you learned from that. I sure did. Next, I'm going to install the motherboard into my PC tower. Like I said, I had a mid-range tower using an ATX motherboard. So first thing I'm going to do is just, when I took the tower out of the case, I got a little static shock, which was a stark reminder that you don't want any of that while installing the motherboard. It could, damage some parts. So I have an anti-static wrist strap here. All I need to do is ground myself by attaching the lead to somewhere on the case here once I begin to install my motherboard. So just a little safety tip, more so for the safety of your motherboard than anything else. Remove the front and back of the tower here. This is the back. So it has a nice little cable management system back here. One of the reasons I got this tower, I just like the look of the tower. Really cool. I like the red-black color scheme. But in one of the YouTube videos I watched from building how to build a PC, they used a similar tower from the same company, and I really just kind of liked it. I like the look of it, the feel of it, the way that the setup and the layout looked. So for me, that was enough. Just be, hey, listen, yeah, this is the one I want. It's got some cables here bagged up. We'll need those later. It's got the hardware in this box here. Everything uses thumb screws for the back and the front. So what I did was I just took a little box lid, shout out to Zippo, to keep everything kind of just where I know I can access it. Putting the tower on its back here. Before I actually install the motherboard, just a few things I learned. So again, we have the ATX motherboard format. You see there's 3 different form factors here. So we're using the ATX. One of the nice things about this tower, I'm sure other towers do it too, is they label these little kind of mounting points that's compatible with your motherboard. So this obviously is kind of the centerpiece. It's compatible with all 3 formats. Then from there, you can see, if your particular motherboard is compatible with these spots. So here we'll be using the A. There's these little kind of screws that pop up. Again, just mounting points so we can install all the hardware later once the motherboard fits in. But the motherboard should just slide right in. All right, so I have the anti-static strap on, motherboard in. I'm going to have to figure out what to do with this cable here. This is for the RGB light on the fan. One thing I wasn't sure in the beginning was if I'd have to take off the I/O shield from the motherboard and then install or clip it in. It seems pretty snug. I did not take it off. The problem was it seems to be screwed in from the back of the motherboard, so there's no way I can access that once the motherboard's in the tower. So that's why I think it's meant to just go in, and again, it's pretty snug. It doesn't have to snap in, or it's not moving around in there. So I think we're okay. But I'm gonna go ahead and start securing this, put this in place, and then we'll install the GPU. All right, we have to screw in the motherboard. So these are the instructions for my tower. So motherboard installation, it says for the screws, use B. If we look, I might have set it on the actual board as well, but I didn't check before I put it in. But anyway, here we go. So 632 by 5 millimeters. And if we look over here, here we go. All right. There's 2 of them, and they are not the hex screws. They're just the rounded tops, which is what these are, or flat, I should say. So go ahead and do that. All right, next we got the power supply unit. We're going to install that here on the tower. The instructions suggest that we install this with the fan facing down. There is a dust collection tray here. It's kind of a nice little feature. just so we can clean that out nice and easy. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on installing this and let you know how it goes. Very straightforward installation. It just goes here on the side. It looks like it's upside down, but the fan is on the bottom as suggested. Then there's these mounting points here, that we just want to align. And then once it's aligned, we can go ahead and screw that in. All the cables that we're going to be connecting later is in the back here. We'll deal with that cable management later. But right now I'm going to screw this in. One very important note you may have noticed previously, this came out of the box essentially in on, not plugged in, didn't plug it in yet, but always make sure that the output is off once the before you plug it in or start anything up. So just wanted to include that. Next I'll be installing the GPU. This particular tower allows for a vertical or horizontal installation. Usually it's a horizontal by default. So I'm going to be using the PCIe, so it's PCI Express slot here to go with this GPU. I mentioned before I got this Radeon RX 570 8GB. 8GB because I really wanted the RAM speed to be higher on this. Again, not really a gaming rig I'm building, but I would possibly like to play some games on there, but I'm not going to be using this for any like high res or really powerful games. So that being said, I'm going to have to disassemble two of these access slots here. This would be for if I want to use it as a vertical mount, and really the only purpose of that is so you can kind of see it, see your rig kind of in action, whereas a horizontal you really can't see it. It's going to look like that. But I also need this PCIe kind of extension cord to make it go vertical, which I don't have, but again I wasn't looking to do that anyway. So I'm going to start by undoing this thumb screw, getting this out, getting these out. Just it does take two. As you can see here, it's a 2-slot access. You'll see all the different inputs here covered up right now, but I'll show you the result when I'm done installing. GPU is installed. Had to go one down from the top here. Originally I took this one off, but when it lined up, you needed to get these two out. So everything's back where it needs to be. You can see the fans are on the bottom there. It is aesthetically, you probably do want to see the fans, but functionality always beats aesthetics in my opinion. So far this is what we have. Next, all the main components right now are installed. So before we get the cabling, one thing I want to do is I bought 2 extra fans here, airflow fans, that I'm going to install back here. So we're going to do that next, and then we'll begin to start figuring out what cabling and plugging in the components before we move into installing the operating system. Alright, the airflow fans are installed. It comes off this back piece here. So it really just has these hinges. Screw them in from the front, as you can see. It does have space for some larger fans. These are 120 millimeter fans. I think it can support 140 as well. So if we just click that back in here, and these little hinges, and they just kind of snap in there, and then we just use the thumb screws to secure it. All right, and then we have the cables here along with these extenders, 4 pins. So they're going to go in here on the motherboard. Let's see if we can find them. There is a spot for fans, so gotta search it out. There's one right there. It's hard to see this fan, so that'll be one. There's another one around here somewhere. I'm going to consult the motherboard manual. I think there it is. Is that one? That might be another one. Yeah, it's this fan too. So yeah, it's back there. A little hard to see, but we'll get it back there. As you can see, it's starting to get a little crazy back here with the wires. I forgot that I have to install the hard drive, which I should have done before the power supply, because the hard drive is going to go right in here, but I have to screw it in here, so not a lot of space for a screwdriver here, so probably going to unscrew the power supply, give myself more room, install the hard drive, and I'll show that in a moment, and then put the power supply back in, and then we should be good to go pretty much for all the hardware, and then I'll go through the cable management. So another user error. I already removed this power supply for the hard drive. However, this design of the case allows you to unscrew the bottom panel here, and the hard drive chassis, so to speak, comes out, and you can install it, then reinstall it without having to get the screwdriver in there. So another lesson for reading the instructions first before assuming you can't access something. Okay, so the mounting bracket is out. We have a Seagate 4 terabyte hard drive that we're going to install. Pretty simple installation. There's some holes here. They're for the screw holes here that line up. And then we have the SATA cables that will attach to this, and then thus the motherboard. So we'll go ahead and just slide that in like so. See the screw holes match up. Just sits there. I'm going to screw it in, and then I'm going to reinstall the bracket underneath the tower and plug those cables in. We should be good to go. Well, she's running. Not without a few hiccups. So just before I clean up all these cables, I just went around and I matched all the connectors to the necessary port places on the motherboard. Did a test power up, and everything so far seems to be running fine. I'm currently downloading Windows, waiting to install it through a USB. So a few things. One, it has a smart control hub, and one of the mistakes I made was some of the pins on these fans are actually 3-pin connectors, but the fans I have installed over here are 4-pin connectors. So one of them was a 4, so I plugged it in that one. The other one I did have to go to the front of the case and install the pin that way. Had some issues, just the 8-pin versus the 24-pin power connector, GPUs, making sure I had all that set up correctly. I also had an issue with the front panel connector. There just was the motherboard's connector had a different architecture than what was given to me from the case. So luckily there was this kind of adapter connector that came with the motherboard. With the tower, and I was able to connect it that way, and everything seems to be running fine so far. This adapter here, F panel, this is the USB 3. Everything else is plugged in, and so far so good. So as of right now, setup looks good. I'm just going to wait until I install the OS and see if there's any other issues that arise. Update the drivers, test all the components individually. I do have my monitor hooked up through the GPU HDMI, so the fact that that's coming up tells me that that's working okay, at least so far. So no issues right now. The only other thing I have to do is, like I said, clean up these cables, so I can put the back of the case on, front of the case on, after I confirm everything's up and running, and then that should be it.